Good morning, my name is Aspen Clark. I'm a level designer here at SMU Guildhall, and I'm an aspiring narrative designer. Today I'm here to talk about my thesis, which I've titled Spaces of the Dark. Spaces of the Dark is an experimental project that seeks to prove that game and level design principles can be used to increase the audience's understanding of and emotional engagement with a piece of written literature. My ultimate goal with this project was to bring a poem to life in 3D using Unity 2018, while preserving the author's original intent with the poem and his figurative language. And by doing this, I hope to help people feel a deeper connection with a piece of poetry. In essence, I'm trying to prove that game and level design techniques can be used to help people build emotion connections to written literature. So first, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about, my agenda for this. First, I'll talk about my project's context. So I did some research into the role of visual and auditory stimuli in emotional processing and engagement to see if this project would even have a basis for success to begin with. Then I'll talk about my process, how I took what I learned and actually applied it to my own original creation with the intention of extending my research findings. Then I'll talk about my actual techniques, the nitty-gritty level design that I actually did to make this project come together. And then after that, I will talk about the conclusion. So whether I believe my project was successful, a little bit about my playtesting data, and things like that. Then after that, I'll show you my bibliography, and we can have a conversation if you have any questions. So first up is project context. This is research that I did into the psychological and neurological research currently being done to see if there is some kind of emotional link between visual and auditory processing. And what I discovered is that in the past about 25 years, scientists, specifically neurologists and psychologists, have begun noting links between visual stimuli and emotional understanding. What you see on screen right now are quotes pulled from 3 different academic studies that were done by people at other universities and people in the professional fields of psychology and neurology to prove whether or not there was some kind of link between visual processing and emotional understanding. What they found that was very interesting was that people tended to react more emotionally to emotional pictures. As you can see in the first source, she found that Lang, who's the scientist conducting the study, found that emotional processing begins with vision. Secondarily, in the second source I've got there, the study is talking about a congruence between visual and auditory stimuli. So if someone sees an image of a car wreck while hearing sounds of a car wrecking, they are more likely to feel a deeper emotional connection to that than if they just saw the picture or just heard the sounds. Thirdly, studies found that viewing highly arousing visual images, these are images that are not necessarily sexually arousing, but that arouse strong emotions like anger and despair, elicited a similar reaction that actually being there would have on somebody. So again, if you are seeing pictures of something horrible or something beautiful, it elicits a similar emotional and physiological response in your brain to actually being there. This was how I knew that I could use something like this, like visual and auditory stimuli, to bring poetry to life. Poetry is a very emotional medium by nature, and being able to realize that emotion and further the author's intent in 3D space would be incredibly cool and very possible with a game, because games have the power to shift and change immediately along with the sort of ever-shifting and ever-changing landscape of a poem. This is the most important quote that I think I was able to distill out of all the research I did into this area, which is one step further than just categorization. Our visual cortex helps us process emotion. So armed with that knowledge and sort of a scientific backing for what I wanted to do, this is sort of a little bit of a brief dissection of my actual process, what I actually went through to bring a poem to life in 3D space and see if I could get on the road to creating a deeper emotional understanding of that poem by realizing it in visual and auditory mediums using a game. To begin with, I selected an author. I chose T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot. He is a 20th century American poet who lived in Paris and in London for a long time and was very inspired by those cities. He has written a lot of poetry with themes and emotions that are very relevant to today's audiences. He has been heavily researched by literary and philosophical scholars. He's incredibly prolific, so I had a lot of material to choose from. And there are a lot of interesting recurring themes between his poems. There's this idea of what he calls the unreal city, which is a city where the human spirit is kind of dissolved and religion and spirituality would clash with industry. There's, like I said, he talks a lot about the nature of the human spirit, a lot about death and resurrection, and really these sort of interesting cycles. And one of his poems that does this particularly is one of his earliest poems, Rhapsody on a Windy Night. T.S. Eliot wrote this poem when he was 23 years old in 1911. The great thing about this poem from a level design perspective is it has a really interesting and very concrete setting. The first line of the poem says, at 12 o'clock along the reaches of the streets, held in a lunar synthesis. Right away, Eliot is establishing that this poem takes place on a city street at night. That meant that as I was going forward, trying to build a level, I had a really great skeleton that I could work from. I could start with a city, and I could work my way up from there. The poem also has a linear narrative. There are 7 different stanzas in the poem, but 5 of them are sort of highlighted by times. The first is 12 o'clock. Later there's 1:30, 2:30, 3:30, and then the poem ends at 4 o'clock in the morning. So this poem essentially catalogs a 4-hour walk through a sort of weird, desolate city, which is peppered by really interesting sort of observations that are made by an uncommon source, which are these sentient, verbose street lamps that speak to the speaker of this poem in sort of odd, dated ways with this weird verbiage and make odd observations about the world around the speaker too. There's a lot of really interesting disjointed imagery in this poem. For instance, Eliot is talking about the city street, but then at the very end of the first stanza, he says, "Midnight shakes the memory as a madman shakes a dead geranium." So he's talking about how nighttime is shaking his memory, making the memory of the speaker disjointed and odd. And along the way, as the speaker is moving through the latter, about 3/4 of the poem, they see these odd things as the street lamps talk about them. He talks about, in one stanza, the memory throws up high and dry a crowd of twisted things, a twisted branch upon the beach. So there's a beach, and then in the next stanza he says, a broken spring in a factory yard, rust that clings to the form that the strength has left. He's talking up here about, a factory yard. There's a point where there's a child running along the street. He's talking about a crab in a tide pool at one point. So there's these disjointed images that I could bring to life using level geometry, and also the sort of linear flow of the poem is connected by that larger structure of time. After I had selected my poem and sort of started this process, I did some poetic analysis. I did a personal analysis of the poem, and then I backed it up with professional analysis as well, so that I wasn't just relying on my own conclusions when I was determining what moments in the poem are the most evocative or the most critically acclaimed. What I discovered were 4 super important things. Rhapsody on a Windy Night has a dreamlike and disjointed quality. The speaker is lost and confused by the images and revelations that he experiences in this dream. There's a linear structure, though the figurative language is disjointed and communicates uncertainty. And there are 2 distinct voices, the speakers and the street lamps. This one is very important to my work, and so I'm going to highlight a quote from one of my sources here, which is, "In Rhapsody, regard and remark are used, and the effect strikes the reader as very mannered and rather odd. The increasing remoteness of the old senses of regard and remark is emphasized by the fact that it is no longer a human narrator who is using these words." Eliot right here, a scholar who studies Eliot right here is directly confirming my belief that there are 2 speakers in this poem. There is the speaker himself, and then there's the street lamps. And when I was creating my level, I wanted to emphasize that difference using sound. After I did this sort of analysis, I identified some key themes and moods based on actual lines from the poem. I identified 5 of them: insanity and instability, personification of the inhuman, mourning and despair, cruelty and unkindness, and disjointed memory. All 5 of these are highlighted on this slide with quotes from the actual poem that backs up my conclusions here. Next, after I had identified what I wanted to do, after I had analyzed this poem, selected an author, I knew that I needed to actually come up with a concrete sort of high concept plan for my artifact, and that is this, which is that I decided that I would create a city environment like the city environment that Eliot describes in Rhapsody on a Windy Night, which would include visuals that shifted and changed in according with the language of the poem and also Eliot's larger poetic themes. My visuals and my audio would be directly inspired by what Eliot was saying, literally in the poem, and also what he was trying to communicate in sort of a more interpretive, metaphorical sense. And I also made the decision that the player would hear Rhapsody on a Windy Night read aloud to them as they progressed on a linear path through my level. a linear level with a linear poem being read aloud to the player as they progress through it, and the positioning of their position in the level would determine what they were hearing, was a great way for me to create the congruence between auditory and visual stimuli that my research suggested would create the greatest emotional understanding of this poem in people. Before I began, I identified several impactful moments in the poem. These are highlighted here with the numbers that are on my screen here. This is my sort of final paper map of my space, but getting here was definitely not I didn't just start with a digital paper map. What I did first actually was a little bit of math. So because I knew I wanted to have congruent visual and audio stimuli to hopefully help people's emotional understanding of this poem be increased, I needed to figure out exactly how long it took to read parts of the poem and then build my level accordingly. So I basically was building my level to scale with time. I was using the poem to control the pacing of my level and the actual physical space too. This image right here shows my sort of timeout screen of my timeout sheet of how long it takes to read individual lines of the poem. The lines in bold are the street lamps lines, and the lines not in bold are the lines that Eliot's regular human speaker says. Before I began actually building, I did a little bit of experimentation in Unity and figured out exactly how long, exactly what asset pack I was using first, and then exactly how long it took my character to walk one floor tile. Then what I did was I scaled it so that it took the character 1 second to move one floor tile. I figured out that the character moves 1.6 meters a second. This is 1.6 meters at a forward speed of 4 in Unity and a height of 3.5 in Unity. Having this as sort of my metric and measurement made it really, really easy to start things like this, which was figuring out my paper map. This paper map is actually built to scale with time, and the numbers, as you can see along the way here, are highlighted. These are indicative of which line of the poem would be heard at certain times. So for instance, line 8 would be heard here. By the time you got to this point, you'd be ready to hear line 9. By the time you got here, you'd be ready to hear line 10. This is actually, like I said, scaled to the size of my floor tiles in the asset pack I was using. So I would be able to figure out, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this takes 3 seconds to read this line because it's 6 pieces of graph, 6 graph sheets long or 3 floor tiles long. Doing this was a very effective way for me to plan and start deciding, what I would be building and exactly how long it would take the player to play through my level. After I had a paper map that was solid, I actually constructed just the floors of the city in Unity and did a test to see if my idea of scaling it so that the player moved one tile once per 1 second worked. After I had hammered out just a little bit of irregularities with things like people turning corners not exactly happening quite as fast as I was expecting, then I began doing initial visuals. I built up the city just around the floors that I had. I didn't want to get too deeply entrenched in actually creating the visuals of my level yet, because I didn't, I needed to do more research into other games, and I needed to do more research into the poem and figure out exactly what I should be doing and what I should be emphasizing with the visuals. But I did create these sort of alleyways. I used a beautiful asset package from the Unity store that had these lovely Victorian alleyway facades. I decided to set my level in the Victorian era for a couple different reasons. It's a dramatic setting. First of all, it's sort of in keeping with Eliot's poetry, as he lived in Paris and London, which are both sort of Victorian-inspired or Victorian-looking cities. This era also has dramatic street lamps, which, because they're so important in the poem and because I knew I wanted to use them to light my level, was very important for me. So I considered a couple different settings, but ended up settling on Victorian alleyways for that specific reason. Now, my second part of my process involved not just analyzing a poem, but analyzing games. Analyzing games with strong narrative elements and similar themes to what I was trying to communicate to my players, and seeing exactly how the professionals were doing what I was trying to do. An interesting thing that I found is that my project, basically bringing a poem or a piece of literature to life using games, has not necessarily been done before. So I had to look at a lot of games and find really good elements of each one and figure out exactly what I wanted to distill from those games and create something new. The first game I looked at was Gree. If you haven't played this game, it's absolutely beautiful. It is a story about personal loss that is told through this gorgeous dialogue-free narrative where your progress as the character changes the world's appearance and also your own abilities. These are the 3 things that I was able to distill as the most important things that I could take out of this game. The quote that I found is the most important here is a quote from the founder of Nomada Studios, which is, "The goal was to communicate the stages of a realistic psychological journey from oppression to empowerment, but to do so through metaphor and symbolism rather than words and dialogue." This is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to extend the idea of Eliot's poetry using visuals, using metaphor, rather than using dialogue and, sort of like a plot for my game. So Gree was provided a lot of great, sort of research and understanding into that area. The second game I looked at was Journey. Journey is incredible. It was lauded when it came out, and people still look at it today. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, but the reasons that I identified as being relevant to my project were that its inspiration is drawn from uncommon sources. It was created with the intent to inspire emotion and understanding between people, and then its sound is one of the reasons that it's particularly impactful. I found a particular inspiration in the sound in Journey. I learned from reading an interview with the composer Alan Wintory that the music in Journey is actually an adaptive score, which means that it changes depending on the situation and also the player's actions. So I was, sort of creating not necessarily a score that was adaptive, but as the player progressed forward, they controlled what they were hearing. If you stop in my level, you won't hear the rest of the poem. The poem doesn't go on without you. Your progress through the level changes what you're hearing. The inspiration from religion and spirituality in Journey was also really interesting to me. The creator of the game, Genova Chen, who I read several interviews with, luckily he's very verbose, talked about how he felt that Journey was a very spiritual game. He believes that a lot of religions share an affinity with Journey, as you can see in the quote here on my screen. He thinks that a lot of religions share a common structure, and sort of the same thing is true with poetry. A lot of poems share a common structure too. A lot of them are concrete words on the page that you're reading that have a deeper meaning. And so looking at how he took inspiration from a lot of different religions and synthesized them down into inspiration for one game, I could look at how, a lot of different authors and artists and other people have visualized poetry and can send it down into one little game. The third game I looked at was Dear Esther. Dear Esther has a great setting for what I was trying to do too. This sort of desolate Scottish island was like kind of the same type of mood and atmosphere that I was going for with my level, that kind of desolation and sort of washed out darkness. It also draws from literature a lot. One review of the game talks about this game as being a layer cake of potential meanings, which has a lot of intertextual and biblical references sort of laid into it. There is a lot of sort of connection to classical fiction in this game. As you can see in one of my sources here, it says, its atmosphere and attention for haunted landscapes quickly allow us to associate it with classic fiction. And then it also straddles the line between game and experience. This was another thing that my level was doing as well. It's a game because you play through it in 3D space. It is a walking sim, just like Dear Esther is a walking sim, but it's also a little bit more than that. It's a little bit more on the critical content side of the art world a bit. And I wanted to find a way to straddle that line while remaining in the game space, but being able to communicate larger, more literary ideas than typical games usually convey. The next game I looked at was Limbo. Limbo, the most interesting thing I was able to find out about this game is that a lot of people believe that the shifts in visuals are connected to the narrative. There are a myriad of theories about exactly what Limbo means and what all the symbolism in Limbo is, but the obstacles, a lot of people believe that things in this game, like the spiders and the forest and the city, are representative of stages of the little boy's life, or maybe his own personal fears. One of my sources says the obstacles could be representative of the boy's fears and traumas, his fear of spiders, his fear of the bullies who picked on him, his fear of drowning. And the shift midway through from natural to mechanical could signify a traumatic family move. So again, this is not something that Limbo is communicating with dialogue to the player. This type of sort of environmental observation is very important for Limbo and a lot of games like it, and it's something that I wanted to try to sort of emphasize in my level as well. Another game I looked at was Amnesia. Because I'm creating something that has a lot to do with insanity and darkness and sort of oddness, Amnesia was a perfect place to look. Sanity and insanity are core mechanics in this game. There are really interesting camera effects and auditory effects that happen as the character is going insane. As you can see on my top quote here, sanity is a mechanic which represents Daniel and Justine's mental condition. Staying in the darkness, witnessing disturbing events, or staring at enemies will drain sanity. So while I'm not working on sort of a draining mechanic, I do want the player to get the sense that things are sort of devolving around them throughout my level, and Amnesia provided a great place to look for inspiration for that. The last game I analyzed was Soma. Soma is actually made by the same company that made Amnesia, and it shows. There's a lot of similar themes between the two games, but Soma is different because it is a lot more existential. Amnesia is a much more classic horror game. Soma presents the audience with some really interesting dilemmas and moral questions that actually reminded me a lot of poetry. The last quote that's on this page here from one of my sources says, "In one early scene, I encountered a robot that talked a little bit like Portal's GLaDOS. I needed to disconnect her from a power source in order to power up a nearby device to advance in the game. It was a little weird when I unplugged her. She says I was happy as her lights go out, and I felt uneasy." So again, personification of the inhuman is a very important theme in Rhapsody on a Windy Night, and this game is a great example of personifying inhuman characters. The monsters are inhuman, but these robots that you sort of develop an odd little relationships and moments with are even more human, I think, than a lot of the other characters in the game. They are sort of the developers use this as a means to make the player question themselves existentially a little bit. There's a lot of sort of existential dread tied in with the horror of this game, as you can see from the two quotes up here. The question in Soma asks is whether identity can continue through psychology alone. Soma isn't about obvious awful choices, it's about the kind of evils we consider mundane or even necessary. As the plot moves more firmly into science fiction, it pushes our definitions of life and humanity into the theoretical. So again, there's a lot of sort of this personification of the inhuman in Rhapsody on a Windy Night, and that was the greatest piece of inspiration I was able to draw from Soma. Now I'll talk about the actual level techniques. What I've done here to do this is I have pulled out moments of my level that my playtesters found particularly impactful, and I have compared them and showed you exactly what level design techniques I'm using in relation to other games that I've referenced just now, and sort of I can help you understand exactly like where these techniques are found in the industry and how I'm realizing them in my level. The first is a presence of landmarks. What I've done here, just for ease of understanding, is this is the line of poetry that you hear when you see this presented above it right here. There's a little bit about how I'm using it, and then on my next slide, I'll talk about where it's used in actual games. So the first thing that I did is using landmarks to help the player gauge their progress. I decided to use the moon as a landmark because the moon appears several times as a symbol in the poem. In the first stanza, we are listening to whispered lunar incantations. Later on, we are told to regard the moon. Eliot talks about, once again, it's nighttime, the moon is up. It's referred to several times in the poem. So that's why I chose to use it as a landmark like this. This happens early on in the game. As you can see, the moon is very distant. This happens a little bit later, about midway through, and as you can see, the moon is a lot closer here and more front and center. So this is kind of indicating a longer journey. This is indicating a straight line towards them. A great example of landmarks being used this way in other games is Journey. This mountain is the player's ultimate goal in Journey, and they are going from a very, very far away to moving up closer to it. This game does a great job of landmarking and showing exactly like, you've made progress. You can tell because every time you beat a dungeon or a temple or an area, you come out and you can see the mountain has gotten a little bit closer. The second thing that I did was I used color grading and scene tinting to increase feelings of unease and just sort of change the overall mood and tone of my level. This sort of washed out color palette here goes along with the line, dissolve the floors of memory and all its clear relations. This odd sort of yellowish green one goes with the line, regard that woman who hesitates towards you. I chose to use yellow and green here because one of my sources, verywellmind.com, which is a site dedicated to sort of understanding color theory, actually noted that greens and yellows, particularly this shade, this sort of odd yellowish green, often indicates sort of instability and unkindness and uncertainty, while sort of more washed out sepia tone color palettes like this generally indicate like settled, something still and sort of off-putting. So this is sort of, again, two examples of we are dissolving the memory. The word dissolve is in this. I decided to use the sort of mist to emphasize that kind of dissolved, blurry feeling here. This moment, regard that woman who hesitates toward you in the light of the door, is the sort of one of the turning points of the poem. It's one of the most impactful moments that I identified in my earlier paper map. And it's also sort of where things in my level begin to fall apart towards more, sort of devolving more insane. And that's why I chose to make this moment, colored like something that was intended to make people feel uneasy and sort of creeped out. This is an example of how color grading and camera effects are used in a professional game. I mentioned before that Amnesia's camera changes when the monsters are close. This is an example of that. As you can see, there's sort of a heavy fog behind the monster, and there's also heavy chromatic aberration on the camera here. This is a technique that I borrowed a little bit, but I found it wasn't as effective in my level as it was here in Amnesia because I don't have this type of sort of jump scares going on in my level. But Amnesia's lighting overall, when there aren't monsters present, is this kind of odd greenish tint, which sort of the same color ideas that I'm using in my level here to kind of communicate uneasiness and uncertainty. This is another example of something that I did. I'm using particle effects and camera effects to create specific scenes. This is the underwater section of my level, which goes along with the line, "The memory throws up high and dry a crowd of twisted things, a twisted branch upon the beach." So Elliot has moved us from a city setting to a beach setting, and I wanted to emphasize that by having the players sort of end up underwater. It's not a beach necessarily, but the presence of water in the poem is important. And because I'm trying to emphasize this idea of like a dream-like instability and uncertainty in the poem, that's why I chose to set it underwater instead of above the water. I found inspiration for how to do underwater scenes from Soma and also from Gree. Soma is a beautiful example of these amazing realistic underwater environments. I borrowed things like these beautiful points of light, these contrasting lights, and the depth of field modifications to the camera from this game. And then Gree has a much more ethereal, watercolory take on the underwater space, but they do have a beautiful example of sort of low contrast visuals here. The play space is emphasized with these dark lines, but everything in the background is kind of washed out. That was something that I borrowed when I was trying to create my underwater scenes. This is another technique I'm using, multiple levels of light to draw the eye around the scene. Scene composition was very important when I was looking at creating this artifact because I wanted the player to be left with memorable moments. The same way that for me and a lot of people who enjoy poetry, reading a good poem leaves you with these sort of remembered lines. Rhapsody on a Windy Night, for instance, was one of my favorite poems the moment that I read it. And one of the most impactful moments for me was this one, represented here on the left. "The moon has lost her memory, a washed out smallpox cracks her face." So there's kind of a lot going on in this line at this point. And as you can see, the bright points of light, I told my players early on, were meant to help guide you. But the presence of sort of other light sources here and kind of multiple levels of light that draw your eye around the scene is meant to, of course, create these beautiful vistas, but also to communicate how sort of uncertain and disjointed the poem becomes in its later phases. So this sort of haziness and fogginess in the background is not only a technique in and of itself for disguising what's coming up next to the player and limiting sight lines, but it also sort of furthers the intent of the poem because it is, that kind of hazy uncertainty of what's coming next. This is a great example of using multiple levels of light to draw attention. Limbo's graphics were a great place to look for this because the game is monochrome. It's sort of in this film noir, grayed out style. What this game does that I was trying to do also is emphasize the most critical item here with the brightest point of light, and then ancillary items are highlighted with these kind of grayish blobs too. In this puzzle in Limbo, you need to scare this crow away to get this thing to drop so that you can progress. But this is the most important thing. This is what the developers want you to look at. This is what the character is looking at right here. And this is the most sort of visually impactful thing on the screen, this little boy in a cage here. In this scene, this is the most dangerous thing. This will kill you right away if you stay on this rope too long. And this is where you're trying to go over here. So again, they've highlighted the most immediately necessary thing for you to know with the brightest light, and then allowed our eye to wander around the scene, followed by other lights, to the secondarily important things in the scene. Another technique is using lighting as path markers. I was creating this game for people who were not very familiar with video games. That was my target audience, was people who are new to gaming. And so I needed to create a very overt and easy to understand way to lead the player. This is one of the darkest areas in my level, emphasized by the line, "I could see nothing behind that child's eye," deliberately made dark here because the speaker is talking about seeing nothing, the lamp is talking about seeing nothing, and I wanted this to feel very dark and desolate. But as you can see, these sort of bright points of light are still being used as path markers for the player. Even in brighter scenes like this, the light sources are always the brightest thing. Because I chose to use street lamps, I had great justification for this. Street lamps have that beautiful bloom to them if you've ever seen a street lamp on a misty or rainy night. And so I was able to use that to my advantage and use things like leading lines and these lights themselves as actual path markers to keep the player moving in the right direction. What I found was that people thought this was very effective in my playtesting. People were a little bit worried about getting lost, but after I added a how to play screen and told people that they could follow the street lamps, people found it much easier to understand. This is an example of how light is used as a marker in Soma. Like my game, Soma has a lot of dark areas, but they are using these beautiful high contrast lights right here to help the player understand where to go. Coupled, of course, with these beautiful leading lines that are showing me exactly where I need to be. Even in brighter and more complex scenes in Soma, the most important things that I need to see are highlighted by the brightest points of light. This is an objective, this is a door, this is sort of another beautiful thing that draws my eye along this line right here, and this is another, just overall, a great example of how using light as a marker is possible. I used up-close geometry to frame what's coming also. This was done to sort of in keeping with the poem right before large dramatic changes occur. This is a great example of, this is that water from before, right before you go forward underwater. You see these two women who, along with the line, the border of her dress is torn and stained with sand, are kind of framing what's to come next. This is sort of a means of conveying and furthering a literary thing, which is recurring imagery in poems and how poems tend to sort of build and release to little moments of tension. I try to do the same thing in my level here. Every street lamp that I pass beats like a fatalistic drum is another great example. The player moves through this tunnel where they see an odd dolly zoom effect that then leads them sort of into the mouth of madness, if you will. This is the point at which the level stops being just a plain city and starts being more like this, more overtaken by nature, more overtaken by symbolic visuals. And so this tunnel right here and these two last sort of normal street lamps were meant to frame the upcoming madness for them. This is an example of how that's done in Dear Esther. Dear Esther does a great job because it is a walking sim and you need to sort of explore and understand these environments to know what to do next in the story. They use geometry in beautiful ways and a lot of cool shape language to frame things like the lighthouse, which the player visits late in the game. It's an important narrative crux. And that's something that is visible from a lot of different angles in the game as well. A little bit about sounds in my level. Like I said, I did a timed out reading of the poem and it correlated with the visuals and audio to keep the visual stimuli congruent so that I had the greatest chance of creating emotional understanding in my level. I used techniques like pitch modulation and echo from Amnesia: The Dark Descent. There is sort of an auditory hallucination mechanic in that game where when the monsters get close to you, you hear these weird, odd sounds. Sometimes you hallucinate screaming, things like that. And so I borrowed those techniques when the street lamps spoke. To emphasize Eliot's dual narrators in this poem, I decided to have the street lamps have their own voice too. When the lamps speak, they overtake the speaker's human voice. They have this sort of odd, distorted quality to their voices, and their voices are actually altered to make them sound inhuman. And the great thing is, Eliot makes it very clear in the poem when exactly the lamps should be talking and when exactly the speaker should be talking instead. So I was able to concretely, do that based on Eliot's words, not just my own. So this is a little bit more about my techniques and how I was actually emphasizing themes in the poem using larger visual landscapes, not just, sort of concrete visuals. Like I mentioned, Eliot talks a lot about sort of the contrast between industry and nature in a lot of his poetry, and this is a great example of how I'm doing that in my level. This is one sort of wow moment or most impactful moment when Eliot is talking about, I could see nothing behind that child's eye. I have seen eyes in the street trying to peer through lighted shutters. I have the eyes in the street here trying to peer through lighted shutters. And this sort of soot-stained red industry setting here. Back in this setting over here, he's talking about a broken spring in a factory yard, rust clinging to the form, strength has left. This is a beautiful natural scene that slowly devolves into this industrial thing. This is actually kind of the two end caps of one of the stanzas in the poem. So as you can see, the visuals are changing pretty dramatically from impactful moment to impactful moment. A game I found that did this well was Nier Automata. Nier Automata has a beautiful city environment that gets trashed later on. So this sort of gorgeous nature is then gives way to this kind of odd desolation. Another important point in the poem is this line, "Regarde the moon, la lune ne garde aucune rancune." This is a tonal shift in the poem where Eliot stops sort of pontificating and begins talking more concretely about memory a lot. I wanted to separate this sort of last third of the poem out from the first 2/3 of the poem to kind of emphasize that shift and change. And the way that I did that was using this long, sort of straightaway, narrow, dark passage with one lamp at the end. And when you turn the corner, this beautiful vista of the moon here is revealed. And this type of sort of blue illuminated color populates the last the last about third of my level as Eliot is talking more concretely about the moon. I got visual inspiration for my night from games like Dear Esther and Journey. Journey does a great job of using emissive materials to create this kind of glowing effect. And then Dear Esther, of course, has these beautiful nighttime vistas that I got inspiration from as well. Another important theme in this poem is cycles and memory. Like I mentioned, Eliot uses this in a lot of his poems. He talked about memory in, I think, 3 of the 7 stanzas in this poem. And so since I wanted to sort of highlight Eliot's poetic intent here, I decided to create a level that was in the shape of a circle. This is something that, like some metaphors in poems, is very subtle, and a lot of audience members might not notice. But it does sort of increase your feeling of being lost and not really understanding where you're going. So I start the player off here, they're moving along straightaways, and then after you get to this sort of regard the moon sort of tonal shift I was talking about before, you're in a much more narrow, much more winding area of the level. You don't have these long straightaways with visuals that change so rapidly. Another way that I was emphasizing this idea of cycles and memory is repeated visual motifs. So the underwater appears again later in the level, but not as dramatically. And then this sort of setting of like a forest area appears again later in the level, but once again, not as dramatically as it was in the first half. The first time you encounter water is here. The second time you encounter water is here. The first time you encounter the forest is here. The second time you encounter the forest is right here, right before the end. A great example of this being used in a real game is Limbo. Limbo is essentially a circle. I read this beautiful article called Limbo and the Poetics of Attention that discussed how if you're paying attention, you might notice that this whole game is a circle. This is the main menu screen. This is the ending screen. All of these elements are here, present. Everything is just shifted down a little bit. A lot of people take this to mean that you can actually never escape from Limbo. Limbo is just kind of this eternal circle that this character is doomed to wander in. So, conclusion. Audience reception, and then of course whether I believe I was successful or not. My playtesting process was pretty straightforward. People were asked a couple identifying questions, but I didn't collect any personal information like name, age, or gender. They were given a copy of Rhapsody on a Windy Night to read on paper, and then they were asked questions about their impression of the poem. After they'd given me a couple answers, I let them play Spaces of the Dark, and then they answered those same questions again after playing Spaces of the Dark. I had 34 testers total, but at the time of this presentation, I've only tested 9, so you'll be seeing data from 9 people. This is a representation of my testing pool, which is great, because this is almost exactly the target audience I was looking for. People who were either not or somewhat familiar with video games, and who had a wide range of interest in literary fiction. My audience, like a lot of people, trended towards the people who were not that interested in literature, but who did demonstrate some interest. I didn't get lucky and have a couple literary fanatics, but for the most part, it was people who said they either relatively enjoyed or didn't necessarily enjoy reading literary fiction. One of the most important things that I found, this was a question that I asked, which was, do you feel differently about this poem after playing Spaces of the Dark? And most people said yes. A couple people were unsure, but nobody so far has said no. So this demonstrates that at least 77% of people believe that this project concretely changed their understanding of and appreciation of this poem. And this is sort of a little bit of a better breakdown of that data. I asked people to identify how much reading the poem on paper made them feel emotionally, and then how much they felt emotionally after playing Spaces of the Dark. This data says a lot. A lot of people were sort of slightly impacted to medium impacted by the poem. Most people were either like a little bit impacted or up to, fairly impacted by Spaces of the Dark. So these data trends right here kind of give you a great understanding of how my level is sort of helping people understand the emotional impact of this poem. For this reason, I believe that my level was successful. I did manage to include visuals and sound that were directly inspired by Eliot's writing and his analysis of his own writing, and also other people's analysis too. I was able to find a synthesis between games and poetry, and I was able to show that level design techniques can be used to extend an author's authorial intent the same way that symbols and imagery and film have long been used as tools too. And then, of course, my target audience was pleased with the product. They were able to understand it. Overall, based on my playtesting data, my project increased emotional engagement with the poem and the author among my target audience. So I believe that I did prove my thesis here. I believe I was successful in showing that poetry can be made more understandable and more concrete by realizing it and visualizing it in 3D space, along with a congruence of auditory stimuli, as was supported by my scientific research. Thank you so much. Here is my bibliography sources. These are just cited sources that are extracted from my larger bibliography, which I will hand to the committee in the form of a pamphlet before I begin. And then if there are any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much for your time.